How do we document things? Documentation requires us to collect a lot of information about the process and the controls and identify all of the details that we need in order to summarize them in a way that is useful for interested parties. There are a few techniques that accountants can use to collect and compile documentation. As an accountant, we're going to start with the source documentation. We are going to inspect the documents, the manuals, the procedures, and the formal steps that we expect employees to follow. So we'll look at our formal procedure, and we're also going to look at source documents to identify key details. Once we have our inspection, then we are going to observe the employees doing the job. Observation allows us to identify any deviations from the process or shortcuts. For example, if the procedure manual says do step X, Y, and Z, we can identify through observation that employees are skipping step Y. And it allows us to identify those key activities. In addition to inspection and observation, we can sit down with the employee and we can have an interview where we ask them about all of the details of their job. So we can see what the employee thinks that they should be doing. And we can use this to confirm whether they are following the procedures as they're written, or whether the procedures need to be updated. With these three tools, we are going to pull all of this detail together that we're collecting in these notes, and we are going to create a narrative. A narrative description of all of the details, what the procedure says we should be doing, what the employee says they should be doing, what's actually happening, and so we reconcile all of these different observations into one place. This narrative description will allow us to identify whether there are weaknesses in internal controls that we should be remedying. So all of this tells us about the process, the different types of documents that people are going to be using, the systems that people interact with, the controls, and crucially, the responsibility of each employee. For example, when we talked about internal controls, we mentioned this idea of segregation of duties, having different employees participate in different parts of a single transaction. As a review, we should have one employee record the transaction, another employee approve the transaction, and someone else who has physical custody of the asset or the document. So documentation will help us identify whether that is being met or whether we can improve the process by separating out some of this responsibility to eliminate some of the risk. We're going to use that narrative to create a visual description of the process using different types of flowcharts. Here we have 5 main types of flowcharts that describe different types of processes within a business. The first type that we see here is a document flowchart. As the name indicates, the thing we care about here are these documents. We want to follow specific documents like invoices and checks and credit memos from cradle to grave. Meaning, where does the document originate, which hands does it pass through, and then where does it ultimately end up? This is very important for us to evaluate internal controls and make sure that we are compliant for Sarbanes-Oxley. Document flowcharts play a critical role. Next, we have program flowcharts. Program flowcharts are going to look at the logic and the calculations that are taking place within computer programs. We use this to identify whether there's any opportunity to manipulate the programming. So an example of program logic would be calculating sales tax for different transactions. We pull in the data from the sales, we pull in the data from the tax tables that tells us the state's sales tax rate, and we calculate that sales tax liability. If the program has some flaws, we may be missing some of those tax payments, and we may have to face penalties for non-payment. Next, we have system flowcharts. And system flowcharts are looking at those different processes that we talked about. So we have our inputs, we have our processing, our storage, and our output, and the controls for all of that processing. Where does that come in from? And we want to identify all of the interactions that employees and users and partners have with our computer systems. Process flowcharts are going to help us identify the different tasks and decisions that different employees have to make. So for example, when a new sales order comes in, what do I do with that? If the customer needs credit, then we have a decision, so we're going to send it off to the credit department for approval. Once we get approval, then we proceed through the different steps that we're going to complete. And then finally, we have something called a data flow diagram, or a DFD for short. Data flow diagrams are kind of important. They're a little bit tricky to understand because they have different levels of detail depending on how much you want to understand about the system. We use this to identify data sources, data destinations, and processes that capture, store, and manipulate that data. For example, if in a document flowchart we're tracking a check all the way through, in a data flow diagram we're tracking the data from that check, including the date and the recipient and the approval and the memo. So we want to figure out where are we storing that data and what do we do with that data and how do we recall that data when we want to further process it. This is a high-level overview of the different types of flowcharts that we're going to interact with this week. In the next video, we'll identify what these different symbols look like.